There is a dream that visits humanity across every culture, every epoch, every corner of the human experience. It is the dream of standing alone in a vast wilderness, separated from the village, the tribe, the warmth of belonging. In this dream, you watch from the outside as the fires burn in the distance, as laughter echoes across valleys you can no longer cross, as doors close on rooms where you once belonged. You are the exile, the stranger, the one cast out. But here is the mystery that has haunted philosophers, mystics, and psychologists for millennia. Why does this dream persist? Why does the image of the outcast appear in every mythology, every sacred text, every great work of literature? Why do we fear it so deeply? Yet why have the greatest transformations in human history been catalyzed by those who stood outside the circle, who dared to speak from the margins, who turned their rejection into a revolutionary power? Tonight, we descend into one of the most profound and paradoxical archetypes residing in the collective unconscious of humanity: the outcast, the exile, the scapegoat, the shadow walker. This is not merely a story about social rejection or childhood trauma, though it encompasses both. This is an exploration of the psychological mechanism that transforms suffering into genius, isolation into insight, and rejection into a power so formidable that it reshapes civilizations. Carl Jung once wrote that the confrontation with the shadow is the apprentice work in the development of consciousness. But what happens when you are not merely confronting your shadow, but when society itself has named you as its shadow? What happens when the collective decides that you embody everything it fears, rejects, and cannot integrate? What happens when you become the living representation of what humanity refuses to acknowledge in itself? This is the territory we will explore together over the next 2 hours. We will journey through the psychological origins of the outcast archetype, trace its appearance across mythology and history, examine the neuroscience of social rejection, and ultimately discover how the very mechanism designed to destroy us can become the catalyst for our most profound awakening. We will meet the outcasts who became prophets, the rejected who became revolutionaries, and the exiled who returned not with vengeance, but with vision. But I must warn you, this is not a comfortable journey. To understand the outcast is to acknowledge that within each of us lives both the one who casts out and the one who is cast out. It is to recognize that the same mechanism that creates belonging also creates exclusion, that the same force that builds community also builds walls, and that every circle drawn around us inevitably creates a them left standing in the cold. The descent into this particular shadow will ask you to question everything you believe about identity, belonging, power, and transformation. It will ask you to confront the moments when you were the outcast, yes, but also the moments when you participated in casting others out. It will ask you to sit with the uncomfortable truth that rejection is perhaps the most powerful evolutionary force shaping human consciousness, and that your greatest wounds may contain your deepest wisdom. So let me ask you this question, the question that will guide our entire exploration tonight. What if the very experience of being cast out is not a failure of belonging, but an initiation into a different kind of power? What if rejection is not the end of your story, but the beginning of your transformation? What if the outcast is not the victim of society's cruelty, but the catalyst for society's evolution? By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will understand why every great spiritual tradition speaks of the wanderer, why every hero's journey begins with exile, and why the greatest gift you can give to a world that has rejected you is not conformity, not revenge, but the radical offering of your authentic, uncompromising presence. You will understand that to be cast out is to be invited into the wilderness where transformation becomes possible. You will understand that the outcast carries the medicine the tribe desperately needs but cannot yet recognize. This is the story of how rejection becomes power, This is the story of the archetype that lives in the deepest chambers of the collective unconscious, waiting to be understood. This is the story of you, of me, of every human being who has ever felt the pain of standing alone and wondered if that pain had meaning. Welcome to the shadow. Welcome to the exile. Welcome to the place where transformation begins. Let us begin. To understand the outcast, we must first understand the circle. We must trace our way back to the origins of human consciousness itself, to the moment when our ancestors first discovered that survival depended not on individual strength, but on collective belonging. We must excavate the archaeological layers of the psyche to find the source of both our deepest need for connection and our most devastating fear of rejection. Picture, if you will, the African savanna 300,000 years ago. The sun descends toward the horizon, painting the grasslands in amber and gold. A small band of Homo sapiens gathers around a fire, the flames pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Beyond the circle of light, predators wait. Lions, hyenas, ancient terrors, whose names have been forgotten, but whose presence shaped our deepest instincts. To be inside the circle meant warmth, protection, shared food, and the possibility of seeing another sunrise. To be outside the circle meant cold, vulnerability, and almost certain death. This was not metaphorical. This was not psychological. This was the brutal arithmetic of evolutionary survival. Belonging equals life. Exclusion equals death. The neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman has demonstrated through fMRI studies that when we experience social rejection, the same neural networks activate as when we experience physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insula light up in identical patterns whether you've been hit with a stick or excluded from a group. This is not coincidence. This is evolutionary design. Our brains learned across hundreds of thousands of years that social pain is physical pain because social exclusion was a death sentence. But here is where the story becomes more complex, more fascinating, and more relevant to our journey tonight. Because alongside this primal need for belonging, another force was emerging in human consciousness: individuation. The capacity to see oneself as separate from the collective, the dangerous revolutionary ability to think differently, to question the group's assumptions, to stand alone. Carl Jung spent his life exploring this tension between the collective unconscious and individual consciousness. He understood that human psychological development requires both integration with the group and differentiation from it. We must belong, yes, but we must also become. And these two imperatives are often in direct conflict. Every tribal society developed mechanisms to maintain cohesion, and the most powerful of these mechanisms was the threat of exile, to be cast out, to be named as taboo, to be declared untouchable. This was the ultimate punishment. Anthropologists have documented this pattern across every culture. The Inuit would simply stop speaking to the transgressor, would look through them as if they did not exist, a form of social death more terrifying than physical execution. The ancient Greeks practiced ostracism, literally writing the names of undesirables on pottery shards and voting them into exile. Indigenous Australian cultures performed pointing ceremonies, declaring certain individuals dead to the community, and remarkably, many of those pointed at would actually die, their bodies responding to the psychological reality of total rejection. But here is the paradox that ancient wisdom keepers understood, even if they could not articulate it in modern psychological terms. The very people who were cast out often carried the seeds of the tribe's evolution. The shaman was frequently someone who had survived illness, trauma, or a psychological crisis that set them apart. They had journeyed to the underworld and returned. They had been broken and remade. Their exclusion from normal life became the source of their extraordinary insight. Mircea Eliade, the great scholar of comparative religion, documented what he called the shamanic initiation crisis across dozens of cultures. Almost invariably, it followed a pattern. The future shaman experiences a profound disruption, an illness, a vision, or a period of madness that separates them from ordinary society. They are taken to the edge, sometimes literally into the wilderness, sometimes into the wilderness of their own psyche. There, in isolation and suffering, they undergo a death and rebirth. When they return with knowledge that the tribe needs but could not access through normal means. They return as healers, as seers, as bridges between the visible and invisible worlds. The outcast becomes the medicine carrier. Let us trace this pattern through mythology, for mythology is the dream of the collective, the repository of archetypal truths that transcend individual experience. In every great mythological tradition, we find the figure of the exile who transforms into the hero, the prophet, the savior. Moses is cast into the Nile, raised as an outsider in the Egyptian court, then exiled into the desert, where he encounters the burning bush and receives the laws that will define a civilization. His outcast status is not incidental to his mission. It is essential. He can lead his people precisely because he has stood outside, because he has lived in the wilderness, because he understands what it means to be both insider and outsider, both Hebrew and Egyptian, both belonging and rejected. Buddha begins his journey when he leaves the palace, when he voluntarily becomes an outcast from his privileged existence. He wanders as a beggar, sits in the forest, nearly starves himself to death. Only after this radical separation from his former identity does he achieve enlightenment. The prince must become the outcast before he can become the awakened one. Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness, is rejected by his own people, consorts with outcasts, tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, those deemed untouchable by society. The religious authorities of his time despised him precisely because he refused to honor the boundaries of acceptable belonging. He ate with sinners. He touched the unclean. He consistently positioned himself with the excluded, and from that position, he delivered teachings that would transform the Western world. Odin hangs himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights, alone, suffering, an outcast even from the gods. In this terrible isolation, he gains the knowledge of the runes, the secrets of poetry and magic. His self-imposed exile becomes the source of his wisdom. Do you see the pattern? The mythological hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell documented so brilliantly, always begins with separation. The hero must leave the ordinary world. They must cross the threshold into the unknown. They must face trials alone. And it is precisely this aloneness, this outcast status, that makes the eventual return with the elixir possible. But mythology speaks in symbols. Let us now turn to history, to the actual lives of actual human beings who embodied this archetype and whose outcast status became the crucible of their genius. Vincent van Gogh sold exactly one painting during his lifetime. He was rejected by the art establishment, mocked by critics, considered mad by his contemporaries. He lived in poverty, struggled with mental illness, eventually took his own life. Today his paintings sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, and his vision has shaped our entire understanding of post-impressionism. His rejection by the art world of his time was total, and yet, or perhaps because of this, he developed a style so radical, so authentic, so uncompromising that it could not be contained by the aesthetic categories of his era. Emily Dickinson lived most of her adult life in her father's house, rarely receiving visitors, her poems rejected by publishers, her voice dismissed as too strange, too intense, too unconventional. She became a voluntary outcast, a recluse, writing poem after poem in isolation. Today, she is recognized as one of the greatest poets in the English language. Her exclusion from literary society became the condition of her extraordinary originality. Alan Turing, the mathematical genius who essentially created the foundations of modern computing and whose work cracking the Enigma code shortened World War II by years and saved millions of lives, was prosecuted by the British government for his homosexuality, chemically castrated, driven to suicide at age 41. He was cast out by the very society he had saved, and yet his outsider perspective, his different way of seeing patterns, his refusal to think conventionally, was precisely what made his breakthroughs possible. Frida Kahlo, disabled by polio as a child and catastrophically injured in a bus accident as a teenager, painted from her bed, from her pain, from her position on the margins of society. She painted herself with a masculine appearance, embraced her indigenous heritage in a culture that valued European aesthetics, lived openly as bisexual in a deeply conservative society. Every aspect of her identity marked her as an outcast. And from that position, she created art that spoke to the universal human experience of suffering, identity, and transcendence. The pattern repeats across history. The outcast sees what the insider cannot see. The excluded discovers what the included cannot discover. The rejected develops capacities that acceptance would have prevented. But why? What is the psychological mechanism at work here? Why does rejection catalyze genius? Why does exclusion breed insight? The psychologist Roy Baumeister conducted experiments in the 1990s that revealed something fascinating. When people were made to feel socially excluded, even in artificial laboratory settings, their cognitive functioning changed dramatically. They became more attuned to social cues, more sensitive to subtle signals, better at reading facial expressions and emotional states. Their brains, facing the evolutionary threat of exclusion, went into a kind of hyperdrive, desperately scanning the environment for opportunities to reconnect. But something else happened too. When the possibility of reconnection seemed impossible, when the rejection appeared total, a different adaptation emerged. The excluded individuals stopped trying to please. They became more creative, more willing to take risks, more likely to challenge conventional thinking. They had nothing left to lose. The social contract that normally constrains behavior, the unspoken rules about acceptable thought and expression, these lost their power. The outcast was free. Nietzsche understood this. He wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." The outcast lives in chaos. They have been expelled from the ordered world of social convention. And in that chaos, in that terrible freedom, new possibilities emerge. Jung spoke of the process of individuation as necessarily involving a confrontation with collective values. You cannot become yourself while remaining perfectly adapted to collective expectations. At some point, to grow psychologically, you must risk rejection. You must be willing to stand outside. You must embrace the outcast within. But let us not romanticize this. Let us not pretend that rejection is pleasant or that exclusion is a gift we should seek. The pain is real. The damage is profound. The research on social rejection shows clearly that it leads to depression, anxiety, even physical illness. Children who experience chronic rejection have altered stress response systems that persist throughout their lives. The trauma of being cast out leaves scars. And yet, within that wound lives a possibility. Not a guarantee, but a possibility. The possibility of transformation. The possibility of seeing through the illusions that comfort the included. The possibility of developing capacities that comfort would have left dormant. As we conclude this first act of our journey, I want you to consider your own life. When have you felt like an outcast? When have you stood outside the circle? When have you experienced the cold wind of rejection, the pain of exclusion, the terror of aloneness? Hold those memories. Do not push them away. Because as we move deeper into our exploration, you will begin to see those experiences not as mere suffering, but as initiations, not as endings, but as beginnings. The archetype of the outcast is awakening in you even now as you listen to these words. It is asking you to remember. It is asking you to feel. It is asking you to consider that your rejection was not random, not meaningless, not simply cruel. It was perhaps the universe's way of shattering your comfortable identity so that something more authentic could emerge. Now we descend deeper. Now we enter the territory of genuine darkness, the psychological underworld where the outcast archetype reveals its most challenging dimensions. For to truly understand how rejection becomes power, we must first understand the full depth of the wound, the complete devastation that exclusion inflicts on the human psyche. We must look directly at what we would prefer to avoid. There is a concept in Jungian psychology called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites when taken to an extreme. The principle suggests that the excluded do not simply suffer passively. Something in the human psyche, when pushed to the margins, begins to reverse polarity. The rejected one does not merely wish to return to the circle. Something darker, something more complex begins to stir. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this principle, a true story that reveals the shadow side of the outcast archetype. In the spring of 1999, two teenagers walked into Columbine High School in Colorado and committed one of the most shocking acts of violence in modern American history. In the aftermath, investigators found journals, videos, writings that revealed years of perceived rejection, bullying, ostracism. They had experienced themselves as outcasts, and that experience had curdled into something monstrous. I do not tell you this story to justify their actions. Their choice was evil, their crime inexcusable. But I tell you this story because we cannot understand the outcast archetype fully without acknowledging this shadow dimension. When we cast people out, when we exclude and humiliate and reject, we are playing with psychological fire. We are creating conditions for transformation, yes, but transformation can move toward the light or toward the darkness. It can create the Buddha or the monster. And often, heartbreakingly often, the difference lies in factors subtle, mysterious, and beyond our complete understanding. The psychologist James Gilligan spent decades working in maximum security prisons, interviewing violent offenders, seeking to understand the roots of human violence. His conclusion was both simple and profound. Violence is an attempt to repair damaged self-esteem, to ward off or eliminate feelings of shame and humiliation. Almost every violent offender he interviewed had experienced chronic humiliation, had felt fundamentally rejected, had lived with the unbearable sensation of being nothing, being worthless, being outcast. Violence, he discovered, is often a terrible attempt to make oneself visible, to force recognition, to say, I exist, I matter, I am powerful enough to make you see me even if only through destruction. The outcast, driven to extremes, sometimes attempts to reverse their powerlessness through the most horrific means available. This is the shadow of our archetype. This is what Jung meant when he said that to confront the shadow is dangerous work, because the shadow contains not just repressed creativity and unused potential, but also rage, envy, resentment, and the capacity for destruction. The outcast can become the prophet or the terrorist. The excluded can become the visionary or the nihilist. The rejected can become the healer or the destroyer. What makes the difference? What determines whether rejection catalyzes awakening or revenge, transformation or violence, power or pathology? This is perhaps the most important question we can ask tonight, because the answer determines not just individual fate, but collective evolution. The answer lies in what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposites in tension until a third position emerges that transcends both. It lies in the ability to metabolize suffering rather than merely reacting to it. It lies in consciousness itself. Let me introduce you to Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, who experienced perhaps the most extreme form of systematic rejection and dehumanization ever devised by human beings. In the concentration camps, the Nazis attempted to reduce prisoners to nothing, to strip away every shred of human dignity, to make them into objects, into outcasts from the very category of humanity itself. Frankl watched people die. He saw some lose their humanity, become savage in their desperation to survive. He saw others maintain their dignity even unto death, saw them share their last piece of bread, comfort the dying, preserve their inner freedom even when all outer freedom had been stripped away. And from this experience, he developed what he called logotherapy, a psychological approach centered on the human search for meaning. His central insight was this: we cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can always choose how we respond. Between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our power. The Nazis could control his body, his circumstances, even whether he lived or died, but they could not control his inner attitude, his choice of meaning, his fundamental stance toward his experience. This is the key. This is the hinge upon which the fate of the outcast turns. Consciousness. The capacity to witness one's own experience rather than being entirely identified with it. The ability to ask, what does this mean? What is being asked of me? How might this suffering serve a larger purpose? Now, I must be careful here because this insight can easily be misused. I'm not saying that suffering is good. I'm not saying that people deserve rejection. I'm not engaging in victim blaming or suggesting that people who struggle with their outcast experience lack consciousness. The pain is real, the injustice is real, the damage is real, and society bears responsibility for the circles it draws and the people it excludes. But I am saying that within the experience of rejection, within the terrible descent into isolation and pain, there exists a possibility, a potential doorway, an opportunity for a kind of consciousness that cannot emerge any other way. The mystics have always known this. The dark night of the soul is not an obstacle to spiritual development. It is, for many, the very path itself. St. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night as a necessary stage in spiritual maturation, a time when all the usual comforts and certainties are stripped away, when God seems absent, when the soul experiences desolation. But this experience, he argued, was not abandonment, it was initiation. It was the soul being prepared for a deeper union, being broken open so that it could be filled with something it could not otherwise contain. The Sufi mystics speak of fana, the annihilation of the ego, the dissolution of the false self that must occur before the true self can emerge. The Buddhist tradition teaches that suffering arises from attachment, and that liberation requires the radical letting go of our constructed identities. The Hindu scriptures describe the necessity of dying to the world before being reborn in spirit. Every great spiritual tradition recognizes that transformation requires descent, that awakening requires a kind of death, that the butterfly cannot emerge without the caterpillar first dissolving in the darkness of the chrysalis. And what is social rejection but a forced dissolution? What is being cast out but a death of your social self? What is exclusion but an enforced dark night? The outcast is being offered, whether they wanted it or not, an opportunity for transformation that those safely inside the circle will never have access to. This does not make the offering kind, it does not make it just, but it makes it potentially powerful beyond measure. Let me tell you about Malala Yousafzai. At 15 years old, she was shot in the head by the Taliban for the crime of advocating for girls' education. She was marked as an outcast from her community, declared an enemy of her own culture, targeted for death simply for believing that she had a right to learn. The bullet should have ended her story. Instead, it amplified her voice until it reached the entire world. She became the youngest Nobel Prize laureate in history. The very forces that tried to silence her created the conditions for her message to become unstoppable. Did she deserve to be shot? Of course not. Was the violence justified? Absolutely not. But did she transform her victimization into power? Did she alchemize rejection into purpose? Did she take the experience of being cast out and turn it into a platform for global change? Yes. 1,000 times yes. This is what is possible when consciousness meets suffering, when awareness metabolizes pain, when the outcast refuses to let rejection define them as merely victim or turn them into perpetrator, but instead uses the experience as fuel for transformation and service. Now let us turn to the neuroscience of this transformation, because what we are describing is not merely metaphorical or spiritual, it is biological. The brain changes in response to trauma and rejection. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself, is never more active than during periods of intense challenge. Studies using brain imaging have shown that people who successfully navigate difficult life experiences, who demonstrate what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, show increased activity in regions associated with meaning-making, narrative construction, and cognitive flexibility. Their brains literally build new neural pathways. The forced adaptation to rejection creates enhanced pattern recognition, increased empathy, and often heightened creativity. But here is what's crucial. This growth is not automatic. It requires what the psychologist Richard Tedeschi calls deliberate rumination, the conscious effort to find meaning in adversity. Without consciousness, without the intentional work of metabolizing the experience, trauma just creates more trauma. Rejection just creates more pain. The wound does not heal. It festers. This is why some people who experience rejection become stronger while others become broken. This is why some outcasts become prophets while others become perpetrators. The difference is not in the severity of the rejection. Often the greatest transformations emerge from the most severe rejections. The difference is in the presence or absence of consciousness, in the capacity to hold the experience without being destroyed by it, in the ability to ask, what is this making possible that was not possible before? Let me introduce another figure who embodies this principle, Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison. Classified by the apartheid government as a terrorist, separated from his family, watching his children grow up in photographs, experiencing the ultimate rejection by a society that deemed him too dangerous to exist among civilized people. He could have emerged from that experience consumed by bitterness, determined on revenge, hardened into violence. Instead, he emerged with a vision of reconciliation that seemed impossible to everyone who had not walked his path. He understood something that only the truly rejected can understand, that cycles of exclusion and vengeance create nothing but endless suffering, that true power lies not in reversing positions of oppressor and oppressed, but in transcending the entire dynamic. He had descended so deeply into the experience of rejection that he had passed through it to the other side, to a place where forgiveness and transformation became possible. This is what Jung meant by integrating the shadow. You do not simply overcome your darkness. You do not defeat it or destroy it. You acknowledge it, accept it, and integrate it into a larger consciousness that can hold both light and dark without being destroyed by either. The outcast who achieves this integration becomes uniquely powerful because they no longer fear rejection. They have already experienced it. They have already died the death that those inside the circle still desperately fear. And that fearlessness becomes a kind of invulnerability. But let us acknowledge the tragedy as well. Let us not pretend that every outcast story has a happy ending. For every Mandela, there are thousands who die in obscurity, whose rejection never transforms into recognition, whose suffering never gets metabolized into meaning. For every Malala, there are countless others whose voices are silenced permanently, whose potential is extinguished, whose stories end in despair. The archetype contains both possibilities, and the work, the essential work that consciousness requires, is to increase the probability of transformation while acknowledging that the outcome is never guaranteed. We can create conditions that support the alchemical work of turning rejection into power, but we cannot force it. We can develop practices, perspectives, and communities that help people navigate the dark night, but we cannot eliminate the darkness itself. As we prepare to move into the third act of our journey, into the revelation and awakening, I want to invite you to sit with the discomfort of what we have explored. The outcast archetype is not a comfortable truth. It asks us to acknowledge our own participation in exclusion, to remember the times we drew circles that left others outside, to feel the weight of our judgment and rejection of those who did not conform to our expectations. It also asks us to revisit our own experiences of being cast out with brutal honesty, not to romanticize them, not to pretend they were not painful, but to ask with genuine curiosity what those experiences made possible. What did you learn in isolation that you could not have learned in belonging? What strengths did you develop in rejection that acceptance would never have required? What insights emerged from the darkness that the light could not reveal? The descent is necessary. We cannot skip this part. We cannot move directly to enlightenment without first visiting the underworld. The hero's journey requires the belly of the whale, the dark forest, the crucifixion before the resurrection. And right now, in this moment, we are in that darkness. We are in the place where transformation becomes possible, but is not yet actual. We are in the conflict, the tension, the unbearable middle. Stay with me. The revelation awaits. But it can only come to those who have had the courage to descend. And now, having descended into the depths, having sat with the darkness, having acknowledged both the wound and the shadow, we can begin the ascent. We can approach the revelation that the outcast carries, the gift that only those who have stood outside can bring back to the circle. We can explore the mechanism by which rejection transforms into power, isolation into insight, and exclusion into evolution. But let me be clear about something crucial. The awakening I am about to describe does not require you to be grateful for your rejection. It does not require you to forgive those who cast you out. It does not require you to make peace with injustice or accept unacceptable circumstances. The transformation I am describing is not about condoning the behavior of others or minimizing your pain. It is about reclaiming your power from the circumstances that tried to define you. The awakening begins with a simple recognition that changes everything. You realize that the story you have been telling yourself about your rejection is not the only story available. You realize that you are not merely the victim of exclusion, but also the author of what that exclusion comes to mean. This is not denying reality. This is not positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. This is recognizing that between what happened and what it means, there is an interpretive space, and in that space you have agency. Let me take you back to ancient Greece, to the philosopher Epictetus, who was born a slave, experienced the ultimate form of social rejection, literally owned as property, denied every basic human dignity. He could have spent his life in bitterness. Instead, he developed a philosophy that has influenced Western thought for 2 millennia. His central teaching was this: we do not control external events, but we control our judgments about those events. Our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our opinions about what happens to us. This is not a platitude. This is a revolutionary insight into human consciousness. The Stoics understood that between stimulus and response there is interpretation, and interpretation is where our power lives. You cannot control whether people reject you, but you can control whether that rejection means I am worthless, or whether it means I am different in ways this particular group cannot accommodate, and that difference may be exactly what is needed elsewhere. The cognitive revolution in psychology, led by figures like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, has validated this ancient wisdom through rigorous research. Our thoughts create our emotional reality. The story we tell about our experience becomes our experience, and while we cannot simply think our way out of trauma, we can learn to recognize the difference between what happened and the meaning we have assigned to what happened, and in that recognition, we discover unexpected freedom. But there is something even deeper here, something that touches the very structure of consciousness itself. The outcast experiences what the philosopher Martin Buber called the I-thou versus I-it distinction in a unique way. When you are included, you often experience others as part of an undifferentiated we, a collective identity that provides comfort but can also obscure individual consciousness. When you are excluded, the separation between self and other becomes painfully clear. You are forced into the I position. You cannot hide in the collective. You must confront your own existence as distinct, separate, alone. This is terrifying, but it is also the birthplace of authentic consciousness. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that we are condemned to be free, thrown into a world without predetermined meaning, and forced to create meaning through our choices. The outcast experiences this existential reality more acutely than those safely embedded in social meaning structures. They must create meaning. They must choose who they will be. They cannot rely on the tribe to tell them. This is why so many outcasts become philosophers, artists, mystics, revolutionaries. They have been forced into existential consciousness. They have had to confront questions that others can avoid. Who am I when stripped of social roles? What do I value when group values reject me? What is my purpose when the collective has declared me purposeless? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that create depth, wisdom, and authentic individuality. The psychologist Abraham Maslow studied what he called self-actualizing individuals, people who had reached the highest levels of psychological development. One characteristic he found almost universally was what he termed detachment from enculturation. These individuals had the capacity to stand outside cultural conditioning, to question social norms, to think independently. They were, in some essential way, outcasts from conventional thinking, even if they appeared socially successful. Maslow understood that psychological growth requires a kind of creative rebellion, a willingness to risk disapproval, a capacity to trust your own experience more than collective opinion. The outcast who has survived rejection has already paid this price. They have already experienced the worst that social disapproval can inflict. In a strange way, they are freer than those who still fear rejection, who still shape their lives around the need for approval. This is the first gift of the outcast, existential freedom born from having nothing left to lose socially. The second gift is perspective. When you stand outside the circle, you can see the circle in ways that those inside cannot. You can observe the group dynamics, the unspoken rules, the hidden hierarchies, the collective blind spots. Anthropologists call this participant observation, the ability to be simultaneously inside and outside a culture, and they recognize it as essential for genuine understanding. The outcast is the ultimate participant observer of society. George Orwell understood this. As a colonial policeman in Burma, he experienced himself as both oppressor and oppressed, both inside and outside the colonial system. This contradictory position gave him the perspective to write some of the most penetrating social criticism of the 20th century. He could see totalitarianism clearly because he had experienced exclusion, because he understood what it felt like to be the other, because he could not take the moral certainty of the in-group for granted. James Baldwin, gay and black in mid-20th century America, doubly outcast, wrote with a clarity about American racism that still cuts to the bone. He could see what white America refused to see, precisely because he was forced to see it, because his survival required understanding a system that excluded him. His outsider position was not a limitation on his insight, it was the source of his insight. The third gift of the outcast is empathy. When you have experienced rejection, you develop a sensitivity to the suffering of others that pure belonging cannot create. You recognize the signs of exclusion. You notice who is standing outside the circle. You feel in your body the pain of being unseen, unheard, unwanted. And this feeling becomes a kind of moral compass. Research in neuroscience has shown that empathy has both affective and cognitive components. We can understand suffering intellectually, or we can feel it in our mirror neurons, in our visceral response. The outcast who has genuinely integrated their experience develops both. They understand exclusion theoretically, and they feel it emotionally. This combination creates a unique capacity for compassion. The Dalai Lama, exiled from Tibet, unable to return to his homeland, separated from his people, has become one of the world's foremost advocates for compassion and human rights. His exile has not made him bitter. It has made him universal. He speaks for all oppressed people precisely because he understands oppression. His outcast status has become the foundation of his moral authority. The fourth gift is authenticity. When you have been rejected for who you are, you face a choice. You can spend your life trying to become acceptable, contorting yourself into shapes that might earn approval, or you can embrace the radical honesty of being exactly who you are, knowing that some will reject you and accepting that cost. The outcast who chooses authenticity develops an integrity that is rare and precious. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and shame has revealed something profound. The people who live with the greatest sense of wholeness and belonging are not those who have never been rejected. They are those who have had the courage to be authentic even at the risk of rejection, and who have learned that true belonging only comes when we present our real selves to the world. This is counterintuitive. We think belonging comes from conformity, from being what others want us to be. But Brown's research shows that this creates only pseudo-belonging, a fragile connection based on a false self. True belonging, the deep sense of connection that nourishes the soul, requires authenticity, and authenticity requires the willingness to be an outcast. The fifth gift is innovation. Every significant advance in human civilization has come from someone willing to challenge the status quo, to think differently, to propose ideas that the establishment initially rejected. The outcast perspective is the source of innovation because it is not invested in maintaining current structures. The outcast sees what could be rather than being blinded by what is. Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions showed that major paradigm shifts in science are almost never led by those at the center of a field. They come from young researchers, from outsiders, from those on the margins who are not yet fully indoctrinated into the dominant paradigm. They come from people who have outcast consciousness, even if they are not literally excluded. Consider the great innovators of our time. Steve Jobs was famously difficult, rejected by the company he founded, fired from Apple, before returning to transform it into one of the most valuable companies in history. His outcast experience taught him to think different, to trust his vision even when everyone said he was wrong. Elon Musk, whatever one thinks of his politics, consistently proposes ideas that the establishment declares impossible and then makes them real. His outsider status, his Asperger's syndrome, his refusal to think conventionally, is precisely what makes him innovative. The pattern repeats endlessly. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, outcasts from the scientific establishment that declared human flight impossible. Ada Lovelace was excluded from scientific circles as a woman, but she envisioned the computer a century before technology could build one. Rachel Carson was dismissed and attacked by the chemical industry, but her outcast position allowed her to see environmental destruction that those profiting from it could not acknowledge. The outcast sees what others cannot see, because they are not looking from within the consensus reality. They are looking from outside it, and from that vantage point, new possibilities become visible. Now let me tie all of this together into a coherent understanding of the mechanism by which rejection transforms into power. It is not a simple process. It is not guaranteed. It requires consciousness, courage, and often support from others who understand the journey. But when it happens, it follows a recognizable pattern. First, there is the wound. The rejection happens. The pain is real and devastating. This stage cannot be skipped or spiritually bypassed. The wound must be felt. Second, there is the descent. You enter the underworld of your pain. You confront the shame, the anger, the grief, the sense of worthlessness. This is the dark night. This is the belly of the whale. You die to your old identity. Third, there is a choice point. You can remain identified as victim, you can become perpetrator, or you can begin the alchemical work of transformation. This choice is not made once, it is made again and again, sometimes moment by moment. Fourth, if you choose transformation, you begin to develop what Jung called the transcendent function. You learn to hold the opposites in tension. You are both wounded and whole, both rejected and self-affirming, both outside and beyond. You develop the capacity to witness your experience rather than being entirely consumed by it. Fifth, you extract meaning from the suffering. You ask, what is this teaching me? What capacities is this developing? What mission is this preparing me for? You construct a narrative that incorporates your rejection as part of a larger story of growth and purpose. Sixth, you discover your unique gifts precisely in the place of your wound. The sensitivity developed through rejection becomes empathy. The isolation becomes depth. The differentness becomes originality. The exclusion becomes perspective. You realize that your rejection was not random, but was connected to qualities that the group could not integrate, but which are genuinely valuable. Seventh, you turn outward. You take your transformed understanding and offer it in service. You do not keep your hard-won wisdom to yourself. You bring it back to the world, not seeking revenge on those who rejected you, but offering the medicine that your journey has created. And finally, eighth, you recognize that you are no longer defined by either belonging or rejection. You have transcended the entire dynamic. You are connected to something deeper than social approval, rooted in something more fundamental than group identity. You have become truly yourself, and paradoxically, in that authentic selfhood, you discover a capacity for genuine connection that far exceeds the superficial belonging you once sought. This is the revelation. This is the awakening. The outcast, fully conscious and integrated, becomes the most powerful force for evolution because they are no longer constrained by the fear that controls those inside the circle. They are free. And that freedom is dangerous to any system built on conformity, but it is essential for any system that hopes to grow. I want to tell you one more story, a story that brings all of these threads together. It is the story of Maya Angelou, who experienced almost every form of rejection and trauma imaginable. Raped as a child, she became mute for 5 years, believing her voice had killed her attacker when he was murdered. She was rejected by her family for her silence, excluded from normal childhood, marked as damaged and strange. Later, she experienced racism, poverty, single motherhood, the rejection that comes from being a black woman in mid-20th century America. She could have remained broken. Many who have experienced a fraction of her trauma do. Instead, she became one of the most eloquent voices of her generation. She became a poet, memoirist, civil rights activist, and eventually a cultural icon. When she died, President Obama said she was one of the most important voices in American literature. What transformed her? She discovered that her voice, the very thing that rejection had tried to destroy, was her power. She learned to speak her truth with such clarity and beauty that people had to listen. She turned her outsider status into moral authority. She offered her wounds as wisdom, and in doing so, she showed millions of others that their rejection did not have to be their defeat. In one of her most famous poems, Still I Rise, she writes about the experience of being pushed down, rejected, excluded, and responding not with bitterness, but with an irrepressible determination to rise. She transformed rejection into power by refusing to let the rejection define her. She claimed her own voice, her own story, her own meaning. This is what is possible. This is the gift of the outcast archetype when it is consciously integrated. Not everyone will achieve this. Not everyone should have to. But it is possible. And those who do achieve it become lights in the darkness, beacons for others walking the same difficult path. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey, I want to remind you why this matters now, in this moment in history. We are living through an unprecedented time of fragmentation, polarization, and exclusion. Identity politics, cancel culture, tribal warfare, the constant drawing and redrawing of circles of belonging and exclusion, these are the dominant features of our contemporary landscape. We are creating outcasts at an alarming rate, rejecting people for an ever-expanding list of transgressions against group orthodoxy. But here is what the wisdom we have explored tonight teaches us. Every person we cast out carries potential medicine that our collective desperately needs. Every voice we silence might contain insight we cannot afford to lose. Every individual we reject represents an opportunity for evolution that we are choosing to abandon. The outcast archetype is asking us to reconsider the entire dynamic of belonging and exclusion. It is asking us to wonder whether our circles are too small, our boundaries too rigid, our tolerance for differentness too limited. It is asking us to consider that our compulsive need to exclude might be preventing the very transformation our world needs. And if you are the one who has been cast out, if you are the one standing in the cold, wondering if your pain has meaning, the archetype is speaking to you most directly. It is saying, your rejection is not the end of your story. It is potentially the beginning of your purpose. The very experiences that wounded you have developed capacities in you that the world desperately needs. Your sensitivity is not weakness. Your differentness is not deficiency. Your refusal to fit into boxes too small for your soul is not failure. It is the first stirring of your authentic power. And so we arrive at the end of our journey together, having traveled from the origins of exclusion through the darkness of rejection into the revelation of transformation. We have explored the archetype of the outcast from multiple angles: psychological, philosophical, mythological, and practical. We have sat with the discomfort of acknowledging both our participation in exclusion and our experience of being excluded. We have descended into shadow and emerged with new understanding. But understanding is not enough. Knowledge without integration is merely information. The question that remains, the question that will determine whether this journey has been valuable or merely entertaining, is this: what will you do with what you now know? If you have experienced rejection, how will you metabolize that experience? Will you remain identified as victim, or will you choose the more difficult path of transformation? Will you let your wound become your wisdom? Will you offer your hard-won insight in service to others who suffer similarly? If you have participated in excluding others, how will you take responsibility for that? Will you examine the circles you draw, the judgments you make, the ways you participate in casting people out? Will you expand your capacity for inclusion, or will you defend the narrowness of your belonging? And for all of us, how will we navigate the tension between maintaining necessary boundaries and avoiding unnecessary exclusion? How will we honor difference without fragmenting into tribalism? How will we create genuine belonging that does not require conformity? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that will shape our personal development and our collective evolution. The outcast archetype is awakening in our time because we desperately need the wisdom it carries. We need voices from the margins. We need perspective from outside our comfortable certainties. We need the innovation that comes from those unafraid to challenge the status quo. We need the empathy that comes from those who have experienced rejection. We need the authenticity that comes from those who have nothing left to prove. The future of human consciousness may well depend on our capacity to integrate this archetype, both individually and collectively. The greatest challenges we face, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, existential risk from artificial intelligence, all of these require thinking that transcends our current paradigms. They require outcast consciousness, the willingness to stand outside our comfortable assumptions and see with new eyes. Carl Jung believed that the evolution of consciousness happens first in individuals, and that those individuals then influence the collective. He called them the pioneers of consciousness, the ones willing to venture into unmapped psychological territory and return with knowledge that expands human possibility. The integrated outcast is precisely such a pioneer. They have been forced into territory most people avoid. They have survived experiences most people fear. And they return with gifts we all need. So let me leave you with this final reflection. The archetype of the outcast is not just about those who have been rejected. It is about a dimension of consciousness that lives in every human being, the part that yearns for authentic expression even at the cost of belonging, the part that questions even when questioning is dangerous, the part that stands alone in service of truth even when the crowd demands conformity. To integrate the outcast archetype is to develop the capacity to be simultaneously connected and independent, to belong authentically rather than conforming superficially, to include others without requiring them to be like you, to be different without being oppositional, to transform wounds into wisdom without denying that the wounds were real. This is advanced consciousness work. It is not easy, it is not comfortable, but it is perhaps the most important work available to us as individuals and as a species. Because the alternative is a world of ever-narrowing circles, ever-deepening division, ever more rigid tribal boundaries, and that world leads only to conflict, stagnation, and the failure of our collective potential. I want to thank you for taking this journey with me tonight, for having the courage to descend into difficult territory, for sitting with uncomfortable truths, for opening yourself to the possibility of transformation. The fact that you are still listening suggests that you resonate with this archetype, that it speaks to something in your experience, that you are ready to do the work it demands. Remember this: rejection is not the opposite of belonging. The opposite of belonging is conformity. True belonging comes from authentic presence. And authentic presence requires the willingness to be cast out, to stand alone, to trust your differentness even when the world tells you to be like everyone else. Your uniqueness is not a problem to be solved. It is a gift waiting to be offered. Your wounds are not weaknesses to be hidden. They are sources of wisdom waiting to be integrated. Your experience of standing outside is not a failure of adaptation. It is an initiation into consciousness that cannot be achieved any other way. The outcast becomes the prophet. The rejected becomes the revolutionary. The excluded becomes the visionary. Not always, not easily, not without tremendous effort and courage, but possibly, and that possibility is worth every difficult step of the journey. So here is my final question for you, the question that will echo beyond this video, beyond this moment, into the days and weeks and years ahead. What will you do with your rejection? How will you transform your outsider status into authentic power? What medicine will you offer that only you can offer, precisely because of what you have endured? The archetype of the outcast is calling you. It is asking you to embrace your difference, to honor your wound, to trust your vision, to speak your truth, and to return to the world not seeking permission to belong, but offering the gift that only you can give. This is your invitation. This is your initiation. This is the work of conscious evolution, one transformed outcast at a time. Thank you for descending into shadow with me tonight. May you emerge with light. May your rejection become your revelation. May your exclusion become your evolution. And may the outcast within you finally find the home that was never in the circle, but always in the authentic expression of your deepest self. The journey continues. The transformation awaits. The power is yours. Welcome home, fellow traveler. Welcome home. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you recognize yourself in the archetype we have explored tonight, share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your experience contains wisdom. And perhaps, in sharing it, you will help another outcast recognize that they are not alone, that their rejection is not meaningless, and that their transformation is not only possible, but necessary for our collective awakening. Subscribe for the next episode in Season 3, The Descent into Shadow, as we continue exploring the hidden chambers of human consciousness. Until then, walk in shadow and in light, knowing they are not opposites, but partners in the great work of becoming.